Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. This is our 52nd NATURA webinar. And first up, we have Dr. Marina Alberti, Brian Verrelli, and Mark Urban presenting on the Urban Eco Evo RCN. This is going to be a panel style presentation, and they'll have room for questions at the end. After they go, we will have Dr. Natalie Gulsrud with the Transforming Sets Thematic Working Group, and she will be giving a presentation on all the awesome things that they're doing. So Marina, I think you can take it away with your presentation.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Let me start by saying, Brian, Mark, and I are part of the core team of the Urban Eco Evo. And as Tessa was saying, we'll do a tag team presentation, and I hope we leave ample time for questions and feedback. But let's start by introducing ourselves quickly. My name is Marina Alberti, and I'm an urban ecologist and professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Verrelli. I'm a professor at the newly formed School of Life Sciences and Sustainability at Virginia Commonwealth University.
Mark?
To you, Mark.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark Urban. I'm a professor in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut.
Excellent. So the Urban Eco Evo Network is an NSF-funded international collaboration that brings together more than 50 evolutionary biologists, urban ecologists, and urban planners to study how cities shape and are shaped by eco-evolutionary dynamic. What we mean by eco-evolutionary dynamic is how the reciprocal interactions between ecology and evolution, and how change in ecology shape evolution and vice versa. By the way, here there is a link to the our website where you can find quite a bit of information about what we do and who we are. We now have strong evidence that organisms adapt to urban environment, and that those trait changes that we observe affect the ecosystem services and ecosystem functions that are important to maintain urban resilience. Now, over the last few years, the network has been primarily focused on building a shared framework to identify what are the mechanisms of urban-driven eco-evolutionary change. But our current focus which is now central to a new research network proposal that we have submitted to the National Science Foundation, is on the interaction between eco-evo dynamic and nature-based solution. And we argue that the effectiveness of NBS depends on the evolutionary processes that are often overlooked, and also both in their design and in their implementation. And why is this important? Is because the rapid changes that we are observing in species can shift and reshape the species interaction system functions that and therefore can undermine the capacity of NBS that are supposed to perform. But also adaptation can be beneficial in a sense that, for example, urban trees may evolve greater tolerance to heat or droughts, and can improve the long-term cooling capacity or carbon storage. Now, this is an integrated framework that illustrates how we are going about to look at the interaction between urbanization, ecological change, and evolutionary responses, and how those shape the resilience of NBS. So on the left side here, you can see urban dynamics, and we include the social processes, built technological systems, and policy and governance, structure ecological conditions such as change the habitat quality, the connectivity, disturbance, and biogeochemical cycles. And those ecological conditions drive evolutionary response in organisms. For example, shift in heat tolerance or nutrient uptake or life history of those organisms, which in turn influence the ecosystem functions such as nutrient cycling, decomposition, population dynamic, or soil stabilization, which determine how well NBS will perform or persist over time. So we argue that understanding those feedback are essential for designing adaptive, effective, evolutionary, or we say evolutionary informed nature-based solutions. Those are examples that shows how documented trait changes in key organisms influence ecosystem function that are critical for climate adaptation specifically. So, for example, coral reefs, which provide a coastal protection, biodiversity support, and carbon sequestration, which are threatened by warming ocean. And for example, if selective breeding of a heat resistance genotype can improve the resilience of and restore the adaptive capacity of those organisms. Urban trees, which mitigate heat islands or store carbon, also produce permit a kind of air quality protection and are also under urban stress. And those changes that may occur in urban environment, as I mentioned, drought tolerance or pest resistance, can also come at a cost, like reduced growth or change in photosynthetic traits, which ultimately affect the stability of the carbon sequestration and other capacity of trees to protect us from pollutants. Another example is Daphnia, which is a freshwater zooplankton. They play a key role in controlling algal bloom and support water quality, but are evolving to both temperature or cyanobacteria, and those adaptations may alter the feeding behaviors of Daphnia, potentially changing their effectiveness in bioremediation. And one interesting, particularly interesting new emerging researches and microbial communities that in urban environment are experiencing rapid evolution and antibiotic resistance. So those are simply some examples for which we have evidence. And basically our hypothesis is by integrating evolutionary principle into nature-based solution can improve their effectiveness to maintain their adaptive capacity. And these are some example of what that may mean in terms of, for example, selecting species with adaptive traits by choosing those that already are suited for urban stressors, or preserving genetic diversity by ensuring populations that can respond to future environmental conditions, or facilitating adaptive connectivity by designing green space that allow movement or gene flow, and creating evolutionary refuge by protecting stable, low disturbance microhabitat for those species that can persist and evolve over time. So we're really at the beginning of this research, and what I like to say here to conclude my part is that this research is part of a broader effort to define key core knowledge gaps. And now I'll turn to Brian, who will share an important effort that we have done really to look at what are the priority of ecoevolutionary dynamic research in the future. Brian?
Thank you, Marina. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is one of the efforts that our network has made towards pushing this, I don't want to say necessarily agenda, but approach forward. We conducted a horizon scan during COVID and published in late 2022. Very briefly, a horizon scan is the idea that a number of individuals get together and survey experts across the field in urban evolutionary ecology. We did this for about 100 individuals internationally, and asked, what do you think are big questions coming forward, looking into in the future? And I just want to highlight here that while there are a number of themes that I think are going to be recognizable to a number of you, thinking about how technology plays a role, sociopolitical, just fundamental processes. We also highlighted how a big concern moving forward is thinking about the application of eco-evolutionary dynamics and understanding how they can contribute to understanding better success in achieving these sustainable development goals and thinking more about nature-based solutions. And some of these questions I've just listed here, you can see we highlight things like climate change and urbanization interacting, which I believe Mark is going to touch on shortly. We talked about to what extent is variation in understanding just the city from a holistic viewpoint, but also not just from a biological, but from a socio-political standpoint. And what I want to point out here, go ahead, Marina, to the next slide, please, since you're in charge. One of the really untapped things that we recognize is just how very little we understand about these evolutionary forces and how they contribute to nature-based solutions and how they contribute specifically in urban areas, which is kind of the intersect of which our research coordination network has been working on. For example, one of the very highly ranked questions that came out of our Horizon scan was what are the effects of urbanization on somatic and gametic mutation rates, and how do we mitigate elevated mutation rates in cities? So there's two core things here. Just again, how very little we understand about mutation rates in general, but the idea that urban areas provide, dare I say, an opportunity for understanding how these mutation rates can be elevated because of light, noise, chemical pollution in these areas. And so we highlight this idea of if evolution is really an important driving factor, and we need to understand how this organismal change and its relationship to ecosystems and achieving nature-based solutions, then we need to understand fundamental properties like mutation, which is the fodder by which organisms and ecosystems change over time at that level. And so we published a paper last year, again, coming out, stemming from the core of our network, that looks at this intersection of understanding urban-induced mutations, and again, how this might provide us with a really unique opportunity to understand how a number of us understand a mutation is not really a great thing, but we also have to understand a mutation is that, as I said, fodder that gives us new variation that comes in that can be selected upon. And so I just have a small figure here that shows that there are a number of resources that we can be using, a number of model organisms, but taking advantage of organisms that have very fast generation times, which means a lot of variation coming in, and we know very little about bacteria and insects and plants and how they operate in urban areas, and the opportunities they give us in thinking about just from a theoretical viewpoint is really exciting, but also from a practical viewpoint and understanding nature-based solutions in urban areas is thinking about, for example, things like bacteria and how they evolve very rapidly, and what that could help us understand more about soil microbiology, water systems, and how these contribute to changing very quickly in urban areas. And this is just like literally at the horizon of thinking about how these changes can happen, but so many studies are needed to understand these processes. I'm going to turn to Mark next.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And as Brian mentioned, one of the concepts that came out of the Horizon scan was this idea that climate change and urbanization might interact in various ways, and that it's really going to be important to understand those interactions and as it relates to nature-based solutions and their success. So we got together our network, and the great thing about networks is you have all sorts of different expertise, and so we were able to apply that expertise to this question of these interactions. And so on the right there, you'll see this framework we developed for understanding the interactions and thinking about, you know, from all the way from socioeconomic drivers to the effects on species and their adaptive ability. There's all sorts of interactions that can occur through climate change and urbanization, and sometimes they're shared and sometimes they're unique, and so understanding those differences is important. But the other thing that came out of this, which I think was pretty interesting, was that oftentimes, at least on the biological end of things, we saw that the two did interact, but often they did so to decrease the cumulative impact of both. And so if a species was adapted to urbanizations, oftentimes it was also adapted to some of the climate change. And so there was some shared resilience that we were able to find in the literature. And so that's an exciting idea going forward in terms of making use of urbanization and those adaptations and those species that are doing well in those cities to actually try to tackle some of the impacts of climate change. And so the other thing that we did here was we basically also created an agenda for research in the future and came up with a number of hypotheses that we think are potentially interesting to think about in terms of these interactions. So Marina, you want to switch to the next slide? And so on the right there, we have a whole bunch of these hypotheses. I'm just going to go into one in detail, and the one that I'm going to go into detail is this idea of urban attrition. And you know, what, like most fields, we sort of took from another area in thinking about biogeography. And there's a tropical lowland attrition hypothesis that says that in the tropics, in the lowlands, that's going to be the hottest place generally in a region in the world. And so there's not going to be any adapted species nearby to come in and help them as the temperature rises further. It's basically this island of heat, and there's nothing around it that is anywhere near adapted to anything else. And so you basically have novel climate impacts. We applied this to cities, thinking that maybe at a smaller spatial scale, but thinking that cities with an urban heat island effect may also experience this urban attrition, where basically it's the hottest area, hottest location in an area, and as that warms, you might start to lose those species. And there's nothing that can come in from the outside. One, because they're it's so hot compared to anything else, but also because of the particular adaptations needed to survive in the city. And so we might find that cities might lose some of these species that make up our nature-based solutions, or we might lose those adaptive complexes that allow them to survive in those cities and survive in those slightly elevated temperatures in cities. So one way to mediate that would be to think about assisted migration of species from warmer cities somewhere else, that already adapted to cities and already adapted to warmer temperatures, and think about making use of those adaptations or those types of species to maintain those nature-based solutions. So this is all just a research agenda, and we look forward to hopefully implementing this and having other people implement these experiments and observations, so we can see if these are true or not, and if they can help nature-based solutions be more resilient to climate change.
Thanks so much, guys. Any questions for them? We have about 10 minutes. And just go ahead and speak up, or you can raise your Zoom hand.
Yeah, Natalie Gulsrud from the University of Copenhagen. Thanks so much. Super interesting and really high level. And I was just at a symposium last week on novel ecosystems, and I'm not an ecologist, but I felt like I was introduced to this very different world of kind of biogeographers, ecologists, thinking about how humans have always been impacting ecosystems and how we continue to. So I'm wondering, when you're thinking about these baselines and how we're going to be moving forward in urban contexts, what kind of baselines have you been working with? Or did I misunderstand that? If we're starting to think about change in urban systems, what sort of data and which case sites, what kind of empirics have you been working with?
Brian, do you want to answer that, or I can say if you?
Why don't you start, Marina?
Oh, I just want to say, yeah, this is a very important question, which is not a resolved question. What's the baseline? What's the reference condition? Given that the reference condition in urban environment is not anymore the natural environment, but is already a modified environment. One comment I want to say is, well, this is not established, not clear yet. This is a part of the research, but definitely one thing they were thinking also, and part of the work that we think is critical as a gap, is to look historically much longer than we have been thinking about the past of urban settlements, how urban settlement over time, not in the most recent 100 years or 300 years, but even further, has altered the ecosystem, because evolutionary changes have been occurring since a long time, and they are only just now more clear and evident, but also they're becoming more rapid. I don't know, Brian, if you want to add something here.
Yeah, I want to, just if I understood Natalie's question, I do want to say that while some of these studies are really exciting and have been published, we've had the opportunity to publish them in some really exciting places. You'll notice that almost all of them are highlighted as perspectives.
Exactly,
And
that was my question. Yeah.
yeah, and so what we have found has been really, really important is before we get ahead of ourselves in how we're thinking about collecting data and doing this, moving to the future, is trying to put forth some really, really strong frameworks. And between what you're seeing here with Mark's study is ironing out some really strong hypotheses and think about these frameworks. Because what we think is a lot of the data have been biased in different ways. And I'll speak of the example with the mutation study as an evolutionary geneticist and thinking about how we connect genetics and environment and adaptation. Almost all the studies that we understand about mutation, which is the primary important factor in evolution when we think about having new variation coming, most of them are done in things like humans and trying to understand cancer. And so when you look through the literature, there's tons of studies on urban mutation cancer. You look at things like Chernobyl, and you look at post-World War II events. Those are really, really helpful, but those are from a health perspective that don't help us understand adaptation and evolution. And so studies are, I don't want to say there are none out there, but studies are starting to emerge and evolve purely because of some of these studies that I'll acknowledge that we've published and have really given more attention to and releasing the reins on thinking about looking at really good studies of everything from birds. So you see there was a picture on the cover of the Nature paper we published on seagulls, birds and lizards and all sorts of organisms. Think about how they are adapting genetically to these new environments. And until we can show that, as you note, until we can show that this is genetic and it's adaptation, it's going to be really hard to convince people that this is something that we can be using in a nature-based solution model. So I feel like that part comes first.
Thank you. This is so interesting, really exciting.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, you guys, for this great presentation. And Marina took the slides down, but I was hoping you'd say a little bit about the design of that experiment that you put up there. I mean, I think that it involved some transfers of organisms from one city to another or something like that. I was trying to figure it out, but then Marina took it down. So
yeah, the details are hard to see, but and for each of the hypotheses, we set out a common experimental design, and so for each of those hypotheses, sometimes it's a transfer from the rural area into the city. Sometimes it's a transfer from city to city. So, for example, if you're trying to experimentally determine if you have a species or an adaptive phenotype that's going to do better under climate change. And then there's the warming experiment. So a lot of these require sort of a warm set-in and then a normal set-in to see the performance of those either genotypes or species in those settings. But yeah, urban attrition would be the idea that if you warm things in a city, and then you bring in things from, say, the area around it that's not the city, if they can't survive, it's just warmer than anything that they've ever experienced, and so therefore you would see this gradual drop in biodiversity and adaptive genetic variation over time, because unlike natural areas, that there's lots of areas that are nearby that might have some of those species or adaptive genotypes adapted to warmer temperatures. In the city, because it's this isolated area, they wouldn't have that. But yeah, so if you look at the details in the paper, there's an experimental design for each of these hypotheses, and so you can sort of pick and choose. And again, as Brian said, these are perspective pieces, but trying to facilitate these types of experiments in the future, so we can learn more about this.
I'd like to answer. Laura put a really nice question in the chat. What if some of these mutations are deleterious? Speaking about elevated in urban areas, and can or should we intervene, and if so, how? Which is a really interesting philosophical discussion. And part of this came up in our Horizon scan. In fact, was one of our questions. What role does human play in the intervention and the application, or is this just something that just happens? Are we just part of nature and we just stand here and watch? And so that's a really interesting conversation. And yes, while we expect that the vast majority of mutations coming in are deleterious, what we know very little about is now that we've shifted to new environments that are urban, how many of these mutations could actually be adaptive in these new environments? And so, to your question, Laura, I'm not going to answer that second one because that I think is a really interesting one, I think, for the social dynamic. Like, should we intervene, and if so, and how? But we did kind of bring that up in the paper, and I think that's a really, really important discussion that deserves a lot of attention from the community. Good one.
Rembrandt, you get the last question.
Thank you. Extremely interesting. Well, I'm not a geneticist. I'm more into psychology and behavior. It's a whole other area or other aspect, I would say. But to what extent can you also include behavioral change? And that's an obvious one, not so simple to answer probably, but I was wondering about it, if you can say a bit about that.
Can you repeat what did you say? I didn't hear it. Sorry.
Oh, I see species adapting. That's a behavioral change. That's something else from a genetic adaptation or a genetic change. So to what extent is that in your research, or to what extent is that part of what you're looking into?
Behavior certainly can have a genetic underlying factor, absolutely, and we have a lot. We understand a lot about behavior from that perspective. So I'm not going to disagree with you at all. Behavior is really important, and with an underlying genetic function associated with it, certainly natural selection can act on that as well. So that role is going to be very important in especially in rapid evolution in urban areas.
Yeah, just
I don't know if Mark and Marina want to add anything to that, but we certainly don't exclude something like behavior as a trait that's very important. And
yeah, well, because there was an example like this a few years ago. There was a study about dolphins or sea otters in I think around the northern part of the ocean, close to Greenland or something. And then it was shown that the otters are a little bit like lost, whereas the dolphins know how to adapt in terms of their feeding grounds and feeding patterns.
I'll agree with you there. I think a lot of us are lost.
I think there are two, as Brian was responding, I think there are two aspects here. One is actually there are behavioral trait changes that we are studying as part of this group. There are also conversation that is not, we don't really have yet explored, which is pretty very important, especially in urban area, is how human and or other organisms are co-evolving and through different processes like cultural processes. And this is a huge area of research, and you're right, but it's been not yet and part of the research we have been doing or conversation we have started. Before we end, I'd like to just say that we're really hoping to get feedback from this group. You have so much experience on NBS, and because we are entering this world, this part of the research will be great to collaborate and find way of interacting more effectively than we have done so far. So I would like to please stay in touch with us. Also, we don't know what will happen to the NSF proposal in this current landscape, but we will go after this project regardless of whether we get funded or not. So it's quite a very interesting area. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Brian and Mark. Let's move on to our next presentation with Natalie Gulsrud and the Transforming Sets Thematic Working Group. I believe, Marina, you'll need to stop sharing your screen so that Natalie, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tessa, and thanks everyone for coming today. Let's see. Here we go. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. So I'm going to do a completely kind of opposite presentation from Marina and Mark and Brian, whereby you were presenting really high-level ideas and sort of models and theories. I'm going to take us directly into a case study. So I'm going to take us to Copenhagen and to kind of a rapidly developing neighborhood that's actually built on infill. So speaking of kind of novel ecosystems or understanding baselines, that's exactly what we've been trying to do in this living lab that's somewhat new. We've been around for 2 years. And what we aim to do in line with kind of our working group here in the NATURA group, where we've been thinking a lot about transforming social, ecological, technological systems to kind of decenter ways in which we understand power and relations within nature-based solutions. Here, we're really thinking about how do we decenter our anthropocentric ideas of planning, development, land tenure, and sort of overall relationships with social ecological systems. And in order to do that, I'm going to provide this case study here where I'll take you through our research on meaningful natures in Nordhavn. So this is an interdisciplinary social science team. I have had the privilege of working together with Chilla, Sophie, Megan, Andrea, Teresa, and Natalia over the last 2 years. All of us with kind of different backgrounds from social sciences, data science to ethnography and anthropology and landscape architecture. And while Megan and I have been involved, and Natalia as well, tangentially have been involved in the NATURA network, some of these other folks have been kind of more tangentially involved. And our driving question has been, what makes nature meaningful in an urban context? And here I will bring you to a very rapidly developing neighborhood. So some of you have been to Copenhagen. For those of you who have not, the city over the last 30 years has been rapidly developing brownfields and greenfield sites. So the way in which Copenhagen has kind of taken on this new powerful green city image is by consuming plots of rural ecologies and post-industrial sites, selling off these plots at the highest market value in order to co-finance other green infrastructure like our metro, which has made the city very livable. And it's a neighborhood, it's a model called the Copenhagen model. But there's some tensions around that. And one of them is that the way in which we envision sustainability in Copenhagen is through density. So the good city is the dense city. And when you have a very dense city paradigm, that of course brings up all sorts of trade-offs in terms of how do we use space when we're thinking through kind of these lenses of optimization, not only optimizing in terms of capital, so seeing land and nature as capital for urban development and other infrastructures, but also sort of putting into question, what is the role of nature in this context? How do we find sort of the balance between quality of life, human and more than human well-being, and this kind of overall urban development paradigm of density. So that's been the challenge that we've decided to look at. And we chose Nordhavn as a neighborhood because the master plan was put out in 2009. Construction broke in 2011. And currently in 2025, there are 5,000 inhabitants. Yet the neighborhood should have room for 40,000 inhabitants over the next 40 years. So we have this opportunity to establish a so-called baseline and to move forward over time to really understand how we sort of envision transformation, how we understand land tenure and the right to the city, also from the more than human perspective, and what that means for sort of justice and inclusion moving forward. Nordhavn is also a very interesting neighborhood because it's sort of branded as Copenhagen's most sustainable neighborhood. a green sort of forward-thinking city. And it's the site of Copenhagen's last large park, a 28-hectare park that will be sort of defined as a nature park, where there's a huge focus on biodiversity. And as I said before at the very beginning, this is a neighborhood built on infill. So if you'd come to Copenhagen in the 1860s, this would have been sort of a very bucolic shoreline. But due to kind of industrialization over time, the area has been built out, as you can see from this image. So what we've done over the last 2 years is we've created a very robust kind of thick data set using geocoded data. So back in 2022, with a study led by Megan Maurer, we collected public participatory GIS data from a representative sample of Oosterbo and Nordhavn. So Nordhavn is a very new neighborhood, so we also got data from the adjacent neighborhood. And we sent out 12,500 surveys to Danish social security numbers in that neighborhood, a representative kind of sample. And we got approximately 3,000 respondents, and we have mini mapped points. Based on kind of hotspot analysis of that data, we then qualified it using using a digital photo voice. So last spring we did a pilot project whereby we invited approximately 100 experts, students, and professionals in urban development to do walks in the neighborhood and to take pictures. So we have this really nice, thick, geocoded data set around what people feel is good nature in this neighborhood. And what we would like to do is share that data with you today, but also kind of discuss how it could be taken further and what sort of data could build upon this. And so I'm thinking about you, Marina, Mark, and Brian, and sort of some of your models and perspectives and ideas, and how they actually could be applied here, and how we could start to do a kind of experimental design over time. So we had some really, I'll go over some quick key baseline findings, and then I'll go into our methods and to some of the more juicy stuff. So basically what we found out is that wild nature, accessible and not accessible, is really in high demand and is thought of as overwhelmingly positive, although there is still ambiguity around it. Water is all around Nordhavn, but there's very limited access. So there's more demand for having access to water. And messy nature is thought of as really interesting. And of course, this can almost be thought of as a proxy for rural ecologies, novel ecosystems, and then biodiversity. And there's a need, despite the fact that many people want to have access to nature, and specifically women over 60 really want more tranquility, social aspects and kind of green meeting spots are in demand as well. What we found to be so interesting, and we have so many pictures here, is that we can see there's a clear difference in terms of positive messy and negative messy. So I'll go into how we understood this data, but the top pictures were thought of as being really appealing, and these were pictures that participants noted as being messy, and the bottom pictures were thought of as negative. And we don't quite understand why yet, but we find this ambivalence to be interesting. And a final outcome, because this is a living lab, we've been partnering with about 20 industry partners here in terms of developing this data and also sharing it with those who are developing the neighborhood in Copenhagen. There's a need for new methods and policies in order to support this idea of meaningful nature moving forward. So our data creation process is kind of like a layered cake. As I explained, we started out with the public participatory GIS in 22, went into digital photo voice in 24, and we also did something experimental, and I don't think I'll have time to get to it, but if I do, I'll share it. We did a co-creation workshop where we sort of co-visioned with professionals and with students using generative AI, what would policy prompts and also design what would designs look like of this neighborhood over the next years moving forward based on the kind of data that they collected. So let's see if we get into that. In terms of the demographic background, the public participatory GIS data is representative. And our photo voice data is not. So this was pilot project, and here we had students and experts coming in. So we have this also kind of interesting methodological advancement, which we haven't quite taken advantage yet in terms of our analysis. We have two kind of different data sets here. As I said, 3,500 participants, 20,000 text annotated geopoints, and also 1,300 eye-level photos. So we have a lot of data. So this is also an invitation to ask to play with this data, to look at it, to maybe workshop it with us, because we would really like to do that with folks in this group. So what we can see is that wishes for urban nature were mapped the most. This doesn't mean that that's the only wish. In fact, there are many wishes. So there are wishes for sports and bathing facilities, also for social areas, for well-maintained lawns and flowers. And for those of us who work in planning and design, it's always interesting to see that these wishes they overlap. They're in the same sites, right? And so this is an interesting kind of planning dilemma that we're oftentimes faced with. How do you harmonize these very diverse sort of ideas of how space should be used? And going back to our original question of how do we sort of decenter this anthropocentric planning process, how do we then bring forth this kind of other than human perspective and needs as well? So in order to think through that in this idea of meaningful natures, we brought in the photo voice perspective. We really wanted to qualify what does it look like to think about meaningful nature, positive and negative experiences at the eye level. And so this was last spring where we invited students and also professionals to come in and to take these pictures and to annotate them. And I would invite you to go in and to check out this dashboard that we created. There's been a design competition in Nordhavn this past 6 months. And so we created this dashboard for industry professionals who are involved in the design competition to kind of give them some proxies of what is meaningful nature and how could they potentially incorporate this kind of data into their design thinking. So here what you can see is you can see the 1,300 pictures, they're geotagged, and they're also annotated. So if you go in and you touch on one of them, you can see what was the image, how biodiverse do people actually feel the place is. So we tried to understand perceived biodiversity. We asked about, do you think this is an appealing or unappealing place? How accessible is it? How safe is it? How inclusive is it? And also, interestingly, we asked about the soundscape. So we also asked, what do you hear? And almost always it was a hybrid soundscape. So here, for example, the person could hear water and also seabirds, but they could also hear pile drivers in the background, and they could hear construction equipment. So this is, again, that kind of hybridity that we oftentimes find in urban contexts. So the nature qualities that are associated with Nordhavn are that wild is sort of the most overwhelming quality that was marked in the pictures. And we also find that accessibility is really important in terms of the annotation that was connected to appealing nature, but that nature was also thought of as very appealing if it wasn't accessible. We broke this down by neighborhood. So when we asked people to take pictures, as I said, we asked them to kind of qualify how appealing is the place and how appealing is this nature that you see. So in the first areas here, these are the most kind of Aarhus-Gillekvarter and Orientkai. Those are the most built up neighborhoods where people are living currently. They're quite dense. And you can see that these are some of the least appealing places, whereas the spider webs on the bottom, those are showing us the most appealing nature, and those are the furthest out. And here wild is really predominant, whereas in the areas that are quite dense, we see that ordered and pretty are more dominant in terms of the qualities. In terms of the social qualities associated with different sites, we could see that accessibility was thought of as being really important in the areas that are most developed, whereas not accessible was most important in the areas that are not developed and that have much more kind of rural ecologies. Interestingly enough, some people also found peaceful to be really important. So we could see that there were signs of restoration and tranquility as well. Something that we found to be really interesting is kind of the ambivalence of all of this. So it was not surprising to us that wild nature was thought of to be the most appealing, and that also areas that were not very accessible would be thought of as good as well. But what we have started to find to be interesting is this idea of messiness and how it then relates to something that's appealing or not appealing. And this is a topic that many of you work with in terms of understanding urban biodiversity, urban ecologies, and also environmental psychology. And so this is a place for future analysis and study. And something that I think could be really interesting here is to sort of use the superpowers that we have now in terms of AI and understanding different shape files and trying to understand, well, what kind of taxa do we see in these pictures? What sort of, ecosystems are available and what kind of structure is there or not there? And is it the person or is it the picture? What's actually appealing or not appealing here? Something else that's quite interesting is that we asked about perceived biodiversity, and we can see that if we just look at the maps where our perceived biodiversity and high appeal, the green spots are marked, we can see that they overlay with sort of the taxonomic biodiversity that is already registered out there. So that biodiverse nature is registered as being very appealing, and that in fact, the respondents were quite good at identifying where the taxonomic biodiversity was highest. There is we can't conflate the taxonomic diversity with the perceived biodiversity, but what we can show is that perceived biodiversity was had a very strong correlation associated with appeal and also with tranquility. And that aligns with other studies that show that perceived biodiversity is linked to mental restoration. But this is something that we would really like to work with further and to better understand in terms of our data. So what does this actually mean for planning for dense green biodiverse neighborhoods? And what might this also mean for our future studies in terms of designing for sort of rapidly evolving nature-based solutions and also urban ecosystems? Well, we tried to come up with some key recommendations from these baseline findings. And one of them is sort of thinking through social ecological connections and how we might advance design for meaningful natures. And here, what we suggest is that meaningful nature is shaped not only by ecological metrics, which are currently really in focus in planning regimes, but how people see, feel, and access these ecosystems and natures. And so here, it could be important to think about how we take in indicators of nature perception, such as perceived biodiversity, in order to start evaluating vegetation variety, visual interest, and nature aesthetics. And also ensuring that green spaces have this kind of messy character. And we also want to advance the idea of thinking about a One Health perspective in planning. And here we move beyond kind of the classic idea of One Health is being something about people and health, but also taking it into urban green spaces and also into urban biodiversity. So thinking about building off of the work of Natalie and her PhD together with Marcus, and linking human mental health to urban biodiversity and the health of ecosystems. And this could be done by promoting vegetation diversity, habitat continuity, and low emission environments in parks and streetscape design. And we also want to think about how we might institutionalize participatory and multi-species planning approaches. So these planning tools could include resident perceptions of nature, biodiversity data, and also insights in how people and other species co-inhabit urban space. And I know many of you are working on these ideas, so it could be super exciting to brainstorm how these might be sort of conceptualized in more applied contexts in a planning regime. And here we're thinking about how we could co-vision and how we can use more participatory tools combined with citizen-generated data on biodiversity indicators. So as cities are tasked to be critical sites of solutions, we have been asked to think about nature-based solutions that are integrated. And here we took on the challenge of thinking about how we actually move beyond kind of the classic power paradigms that are really very much ingrained in these systems across social, ecological, and technological silos, but also couplings. And what's interesting when we're working with kind of land tenure and developers is that we're asked to think about things in terms of transformative change, not only around the transformative and kind of rapid change and evolution of ecosystems in urban contexts, as we heard about in the previous presentation, but also about ways in which we value land and capital in an urban context and what that actually means in terms of land ownership and our ability to really think about this transformative change and realize it. And that's what we hope to do with these findings is, as we've started to introduce them and share them with policymakers here in Copenhagen, as well as practitioners and other researchers, is engage people in that conversation through data, and also engage policymakers in the idea that we can use these kind of novel methods and approaches to engage new voices. So I guess I'll stop there to sort of think about if there's questions or comments. And I would be happy to sort of speak about the generative AI and co-visioning approach potentially in another seminar. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, just should be a quick question, but I'm really intrigued by the messy nature that's appealing. And then you had another slide about the biodiversity appealing. So are the messy appealing nature more biodiverse?
Yeah, so where people where people are marking messy nature, they almost always correlate it with high biodiversity. And sometimes it's not appealing, and other times it's really appealing. And that's what we
Okay.
want to dig more down into. That's what we think
Yeah,
is
yeah,
very.
yeah. No, it's really interesting. I mean, because the idea that I've always heard is that more biodiverse areas are supposedly more appealing, but I'm sure it's much more nuanced than that. And I'd be interested to know, like, well, yeah, what are the characteristics of messy biodiverse areas that people like or don't like? So yeah.
Yeah, well, we want to know more about that too.
Yeah.
So this is, what I just presented really represents a lot of raw data that still needs to be looked at. We were doing this was kind of a pilot study. So this is an invitation to play, for example, if we can find ways to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian.
Brian? Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I had a very similar question to Mark's, and that when from an evolutionary perspective, we think of sort of, is biodiversity more linked to chaos or is it more linked to stability? And so
Yeah.
it's really nice to kind of get people perspective into thinking about what do they like? Do they like that chaos in their nature? Do they like that stability? So I'll move to a very quick comment as well. I really think your dashboard is fascinating. This is the kind of work we need. It's fantastic. What we think of a lot is this frustration of how are cities unique from each other and how are they similar to each other. So the kind of projects, from a pure empirical perspective, we're always thinking about is what kind of projects can we motivate or generate that can be done on a global level anywhere. And so I really, really like your study and your approach because it speaks to this is something that can be done in cities all over the world. And it's that kind of richness that I think is really going to help as we are testing hypotheses about what are we seeing on a local level and how well does this replicate elsewhere. So excellent, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would also just like to motivate others to think about how we could replicate these living labs in different cities, because Eric Anderson and Timon and Chris Raymond and I have been talking about how we could set up a Scandinavian kind of long-term social, ecological, technological systems labs, thinking about Helsinki and Stockholm and Copenhagen. And we already have many of the actors already in place, but wouldn't it be amazing if we could have this at a more global scope? And so I think that's also an invitation to think about how we could find the capacity, but also continued funding in this group to think about how we do that. It'd be really exciting. Stefan.
Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
Just hi. Just something that has come to my mind is when you showed the slide on the how different neighborhoods are evaluated in the Nordhavn area, like Aarhus, Aarhusgade, etc. It might be interesting to find out what, say, how the areas are evaluated by generally, but also in particular by the residents. And because that might be different. Maybe the people living in the area have a different perception on what they wish and then what other people, visitors, also have in mind. And also, it might be interesting, in particular, with this discussion about who likes messy ecosystems and who likes orderly ecosystems, to find out how these perceptions change over time as the Nordhorn area develops over time, because it will grow, it will become denser, and so maybe also the perceptions changes, and that is, I think, a big feat of your study, that you can study this over a longer time perspective.
Yeah, so that's our aim, right? And that's why Megan and I in 2022 were like, great, we have to do the data now, because 5 years from now we'll do the next study and continue it, et cetera. So that's the goal. And we would really like to invite everyone to kind of think about this with us, and to thank you for those questions. And to your other question, Stefan, so we don't know what everybody in Nordhorn thinks about their neighborhood. I mean, we have the public participatory GIS data that, of course, doesn't cover everybody. But what we can see in the newspaper articles that have been written in international papers, New York Times, The Guardian, BBC, et cetera, that are very much pushed by the real estate lobby, that all the citizens who are interviewed always say that there's not enough green space. Always. There's like 2 sentences about green space, and it's always that there's not enough. So I think that's some indicator of the fact that people would like to have more. They have plenty of blue space, but they don't necessarily have the green. Yeah. Nancy.
Hey, so I think we're getting close to the end, and you've got some really great questions in the chat. And the question I had is related to some of them. There's Chingwen put a reference from a Nassauer paper in there, which I'm sure you're aware of, and Stephanie Cruz Mesonet is asking if appealing messy and non-appealing messy could be related to the presence of cues that tell people it's an intentional status. I think there's some really interesting points here, and I guess the thing I wanted to point out is we have sort of long-term studies of people's relationships to their immediate environment. Read, landscapes, residential landscapes in Phoenix, and there is always the messy always turns out to be rather negative, and I wonder if that has more to do with the fact that you're talking about a really constructed area, and whether your messies that are negative are turning out to be in areas where there's an expectation that it would be, ordered and well put together, as most of Phoenix is. I wonder if you've seen that. And then so answer that. And then we have to move, but I want to keep everyone's attention for 1 minute after that.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So I think the quick answer is no, because where we see the fixtures that were taken that were thought of as negative, they're in these areas that are kind of construction sites. So they're too kind of temporary. And I think that's part of what's associated with it. And back to Stefan's point, it'll be really interesting to see how that changes over time as we hopefully replicate the study moving forward. And just to Laura's study or question here, where she asked about how we include the more than human voice. Well, we haven't done that yet, but I'm trying to get money to do a bioacoustics baseline. So back to those of you who are interested, who are ecologists, I mean, nobody wants to fund it yet because there's a lot of real estate interests in keeping the sort of assessments of biodiversity down in the neighborhood, and because land is going to be developed. But we're trying to get pilot funds to put out some of the sound moth equipment. And now is when we wanted to do it, to bring in the voices of nature and kind of overlay it with the subjective perceptions we got of the soundscapes, so that we had this even more layered data. So more to come on that when we finally get money.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalie. And I think we've lost Marina and Mark, but Brian, please let them know that we really appreciate your coming and talking to us. But I wanted to say before everybody leaves one thing. I want to just sort of publicly thank Tessa for her years and years of service as our program manager. This is Tessa's last week. She's been running this webinar, taking responsibility for getting the speakers and for organizing it. And she's moving on to a new phase in her life. And yay, congratulations, but we're going to miss you. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nancy. And thanks everyone over the years. I've learned so much from all of you, truly. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
That's
you,
it then.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. See you
Bye.
next month.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Here.
Bye.
Bye.